Cave Story is one of my personal favorite video games of all time. The simple yet engaging story, the tight gameplay, and of course, all the locations you explore are all reasons why I enjoy this title. I even love speedrunning the game. The joy I feel from all these elements, however, can't hold a candle to my favorite part of this game, the music. Music in video games are often overlooked by the majority of gamers. It's sometimes hard for people to understand why terrible music in a game can truly ruin it. I'm one of those people that won't play a game unless it has at least average music. If a song is rich in its different elements, I will usually like it. This is why I tend to listen to video game OSTs rather than more real music. I'm not saying I dislike all mainstream music, I'm just saying that most of the time, I'll prefer listening to my video game music. The first game OST I truly loved for the first time was Cave Story, the DSi version to be specific. That version didn't look as nice as the Wii one, but it was still a joy to play through. My favorite part of that game was the jukebox. Whenever you heard a new song in the game, you unlocked it in the jukebox. The jukebox allowed you to listen to any song in the game. While I used to use this every now and then, it wasn't until I heard Running Hell, the song that plays during the final area of the game, that I truly started to appreciate the soundtrack. This soundtrack has a special place in my heart. As Cave Story has been re-released on different consoles, different versions of the soundtrack has been released. Of course, you have the original soundtrack from the freeware PC release, the DSi port and the 3DS port, the Wii port which had the new soundtrack, Cave Story Plus PC and Cave Story 3D both had remastered soundtracks, and finally, Cave Story Plus Switch had both Family Tracks and Ridiculon. I have my thoughts and opinions on each versions of these games. However, today I'm going to take a look at the different soundtracks. Ah yes, the original soundtrack. Personally, even after all the soundtrack remakes, this one is still my favorite. The musical variety in the soundtrack is something that is hard to believe, since Pixel wasn't a professional musician. You have the uppy songs like Onto Grasstown, but also the gloomy ones like Geothermal. Time after time, I feel myself coming back to the soundtrack, making it one of my all-time favorites. Of course, I can't forget the song that got me into music, Running Hell, as mentioned earlier. It's hard to describe this soundtrack's worth without comparing it to the others, meaning there isn't much to say here. I recommend that if you want to check out what this soundtrack has to offer, you should listen to Living Waterway, Geothermal, Jenga 2, Meltdown 2, or Wind Fortress. Seriously, I doubt that you'll regret it unless you dislike music. I'll leave this list up for a bit. Get that out of here, we gotta get the show on the road. If I were to say one thing about this soundtrack, it would be this. I am sorry for whoever decided to play through the whole game with this soundtrack because Jesus, I don't think it's great. I mean, sure, if you want to listen to a song from it here and there, I don't mind, but as a whole, it doesn't capture my attention long enough to be worth listening to. Maybe it's my generation, who knows? There are some good songs in here, don't get me wrong, but none are good enough for me to want to listen to the whole soundtrack again. Many in the community like this one, especially when it was first released with the Wii, but I never liked it, and I probably never will. I think a good way to describe how I feel about this is that there's no vocabulary. Does it make sense? Like, there's not intertwining parts, ever. It's always just one or two instruments at once that's making interesting sounds that I listen to with my ears. I mean, listen to the original version of the main theme versus this version. In my opinion, it's night and day. There's so much more emotion and enjoyment with the original, at least in my opinion. Don't get me wrong, if you like this soundtrack, good for you, but I will never prefer listening to it compared to the rest of the catalog. Who knows, maybe I would like this soundtrack more if there wasn't anything to compare it to. Some of the better songs in this soundtrack have to be Mischievous Robot, Labrynth Fight, maybe Jenga 2, and, Moon Song? Nah, scratch that last one. I remember when I first listened to this soundtrack, getting Cave Story Plus on my old crappy laptop and hoping it would work. This soundtrack was my favorite for a long time. Some of the songs are even better than the originals in my opinion. I remember Meltdown 2 and Jenga 2 specifically being my favorites. I think the use of more electronic instruments does the music favor for what the composer is attempting to do. I feel like it fits with the newer styled graphics and does the game justice. What else can I say that hasn't already been said? It's one of the best soundtracks out there, and most beginner players will like it more than the previous two soundtracks, and for good reason. Let's take a gander at one of the songs, shall we? Wind Fortress. I actually really like the original version of the song. It was one of the ones mentioned earlier, actually. The remaster completely changes the song in a new direction. I know many disliked the original song, but prefer the remaster because of its more electronic bits. That, in essence, is what the remastered soundtrack does to every other song. While with the new soundtrack, most of the songs I disliked, with this soundtrack, I absolutely love every song. If you're wondering which song you should listen to from this soundtrack, just pick a random one and you'll probably like it, except maybe Steel Chamber. While the new soundtrack is the most unenjoyable soundtrack for me, Famitrax is the most disappointing. When I learned that the new Switch port of the game would have a new soundtrack and it was based on 8-bit NES style sound fonts, I got excited. When the game actually arrived and I played it, I realized it wasn't that great after all. Most of them sound almost like the originals, but just a little worse. I've never gone through a playthrough with this soundtrack on. Why should I if I could listen to basically the same songs, but better? I think it's a really cool idea, but not fully explored. Okay, I have to step in with a retake because my original opinion of the soundtrack has changed while editing. That's right, opinions can change. Although my overall placing of this soundtrack compared to the others is the same, I don't hate this soundtrack that much, even though it is a little disappointing. It feels like the composer took the midis of the original songs and just add a really loud 8-bit sound font to the different tracks. That being said, there are some bangers on this soundtrack. The song that got me to change my mind was Eyes of Flame, because I really like this version of the song. Another really good one would have to be Last Cave or Scorching Back. There are some not so great ones like Living Waterway or Jenga 2, but overall, I really like this soundtrack. It's kinda hard to hate it though, when it's basically the exact same thing but a little louder. Anyway, also side note, the physical release of this game comes with a mini CD of the soundtrack, except it's the Famitrax version, but it's still really cool. Man, why can't Nintendo do their Switch cases more like Nicholas? A manual and a CD? I mean, come on. This soundtrack was released with the 2-player update for the Switch. Not only was being able to play multiplayer like my dream, but a new soundtrack? Awesome! Let's check it out, shall we? That was loud. Ah, yes, that's better. Jokes aside, this was one of the most surprising soundtracks for me. A rock soundtrack with some electronic bits? Excuse me? I bet some people were blown away with this soundtrack, and good for them. Sadly, I'm not a big fan of rock music. I totally don't mind listening to it at all, but hey, calm down, it's just a preference. With this soundtrack, however, I can appreciate the effort given in. Some of the versions of these songs are amazing. Holy crap, Gestation blew me away. This soundtrack stands alone as a great soundtrack, but paired with the graphics and gameplay, I think there's some disconnect. Unlike Remastered, this soundtrack doesn't really fit what I'm looking at. I don't really mind it too much, but I can see some people disliking this soundtrack for that reason alone. While it's not my personal favorite, I have to say this soundtrack is incredible. So here we are. Most of the soundtracks I ended up enjoying, which was a good thing. Hypothetically, if I hated Remastered and Ridiculon, there's always the original. Maybe for someone else, they only like playing with the new soundtrack. I mean, they're crazy and I just have to disagree, but there's always that option. All of these soundtracks are available with the Switch version, which I cannot stress enough is the best version of the game. Get it for the music alone. It's got a jukebox, so just buy the game already, buy it. If you're wondering what my ranking of the music is, 5th place, new, 4th, Famitrax, 3rd, Ridiculon, 2nd, Remastered, and at the SSS tier we have Original. Okay, you can leave now.